This is the script for the writing exercises. During each exercise, you will respond to a lecture and a textbook passage. You may take notes as you listen. The directions for each exercise, the textbook passages, and the questions are printed in the book, but the lectures will be spoken. Ready? Let's begin. Exercise 92. Academic Topics. Summaries of textbooks and lectures. Now listen to a professor's response to the textbook passage.
Today we're going to talk about the Rosenhan study, which is probably the classic example of the effect that labeling has on the diagnosis and treatment of psychiatric disorders. The purpose of the study was to determine how the initial diagnosis of schizophrenia, how that label would affect the treatment of patients who were not suffering from the disorder. Rosenhan and his team were admitted separately to several different psychiatric hospitals with the reported symptom of hearing voices. In reality, all of the investigators were completely normal, but because of the reported symptom, they were identified and labeled as schizophrenic. After their admission, all of the investigators behaved normally. Nevertheless, their behavior was interpreted by the healthcare professionals as symptomatic of the disorder in their original diagnosis. So it had to be the expectation that influenced the staff. Investigators remained in the hospitals for as long as 2 months without being detected. Interestingly enough, the other patients seemed to sense that the investigators were not really ill. In fact, several patients confronted them. They asked whether they might be journalists or professors. But the hospital staff did not question the original diagnosis and discharged the investigators with a diagnosis of schizophrenia in remission, that is, not active at the moment. The Rosenhan study is important because it suggests that labels can create expectations, and expectations can influence treatment even in the absence of symptoms.
Exercise 93. Academic Topics. Summaries of textbooks and lectures. Now listen to a professor's response to the textbook passage.
Using the basic technique pioneered by Fonts, Dr. Elizabeth Spelke, a professor at Harvard University, has developed a large number of experiments with preferential staring. Remember, that's the tendency of infants to look at something that's new or surprising for a longer period of time. So, she uses preferential staring to assess the general knowledge that infants have without benefit of prior experience. And she generalizes her conclusions to speculate about the basic cognitive skills with which humans are born, those which distinguish humans as a species. According to Spelke, neuronal modules must be in place at birth, and their presence must allow babies to quickly build mental representations of people, familiar objects, spatial and numerical relationships. This innate core knowledge explains how children are able to learn and organize their world at such a rapid rate. According to Spelke, the foundation for human learning is part of the nature of human beings. As you might imagine, Spelke's work is used as an argument for heredity in the continuing discussion about the relative importance of heredity and environment. She asserts that the origin of human knowledge is a fundamentally human legacy.
Exercise 94. Academic Topics. Summaries of textbooks and lectures. Now listen to a professor's response to the textbook passage.
Whales and other mammals who inhabit the ocean have been problematic in the context of evolutionary theories. Since they breathe air, we can't classify them as fish, but they have adapted themselves to life in the ocean. So how did that happen? The most widely accepted explanation has been that whales must have evolved from land animals that migrated into the water for some pressing environmental reason. This was highly speculative until the discovery of fossils that chronicled a number of intermediary stages from land animals to whales, including whale-like creatures with tiny appendages similar to legs and feet. It's now generally agreed that whales must have descended from mammals, and furthermore that these mammals lived about 50 million years ago, and I think that's pretty amazing. Now, the question is, which mammals were the ancestors of the whale? So, using DNA analysis, we see that segments of non-coding DNA are shared by the whale and the hippopotamus, but not by the whale and other close relatives of the hippo, like giraffes, camels, and pigs. Although the premise still needs further study, there's quite a bit of support for the Whippo hypothesis. Although they may not look like cousins, whales and hippos may be closely related.
Exercise 95. Academic Topics. Summaries of textbooks and lectures. Now listen to a professor's response to the textbook passage.
Of course, we must give credit to Daniel Coleman for his valuable contribution to the field of psychology. Clearly, it is a good service to popularize concepts so that the general public can understand and use what we're learning in the field of psychology. In the case of emotional intelligence, companies have taken a hard look at IQ testing as a basis for hiring employees, and schools have begun to rethink the emphasis that has been placed on standardized testing. However, there are 3 areas in Coleman's work that trouble me. First, very little credit is given to the original psychologists who put forward the notion of emotional intelligence. I do not, by the way, blame Coleman for this oversight. Rather, the media seems to have been responsible for identifying the term almost exclusively, with Coleman at the expense of such early psychologists as Peter Salovey and Jack Mayer. Okay, another concern is that Coleman has used the term so broadly, interchanging it with related but not identical terms, such as emotional literacy, emotional skills, emotional health, and even emotional competency. Finally, and this is probably the most serious criticism, Coleman fails to refer to and cite research over many years in the area of personality studies. Instead, he appears to uphold personal beliefs about what constitutes emotional intelligence, ignoring the large body of empirical research available to support or refute some of the specific claims he makes about the relative importance of EI as compared with IQ or other measures.
Exercise 96. Academic Topics. Summaries of textbooks and lectures. Now listen to a professor's response to the textbook passage.
Although I agree for the most part with the information found in your textbook, I am disturbed by the fact that the authors focus almost exclusively on the geographical and geological changes brought about by shifting sea levels. In addition to these, and arguably of equal or more importance, are the serious effects on the organisms that live in the littoral zone and adapt to the fluctuating sea levels. Whether the changes are abrupt or gradual, Organisms must adjust to new conditions as the water recedes and exposes their habitat to the air, or creates turbulence in the water where rough waves can dislodge them and even carry them out of the habitat in which they can survive. Water temperature and the levels of salinity in tide pools also vary with the changes in the littoral zone. And this is serious when we consider that even a few degrees or a slight change in the salt content can mean that an entire species will be extinguished. So, I invite you to think about the repercussions of the various geographical changes on the total environment, including the millions of species that inhabit the littoral zones throughout the world.
Exercise 97. Academic Topics. Summaries of textbooks and lectures. Now listen to a professor's response to the textbook passage.
Although the ecological and the societal interpretations of the pearl are interesting, I think that Steinbeck had a more personal reason for writing it. Remember that he wrote this novella after he had been awarded the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction and had achieved both fame and fortune as a writer. Like Kino, the protagonist of The Pearl, Steinbeck is trying to reconcile his new position in society with his previous life as an impoverished artist. Although the fisherman had dreamed that peace and happiness could be bought with the pearl, he realizes that these spiritual gifts are beyond price. They cannot be purchased. Perhaps Steinbeck is somewhat autobiographical when he depicts Kino's rise to prominence and prosperity and the disillusionment that follows. Success had provided material wealth and luxury, but it had come with a price. Steinbeck was struggling with disappointing relationships and alcoholism. His spiritual life had declined as his material wealth increased. So, I think the work can be interpreted as an allegory of human desires, the vanity of material wealth, and the struggle between good and evil that Steinbeck himself was facing. As he writes in the introduction, "If this story is a parable, perhaps everyone takes his own meaning from it and reads his own life into it. Precisely this latitude for personal interpretation within the universal themes gives the pearl such enduring appeal and permits us to speculate about Steinbeck himself."
Exercise 98. Academic Topics. Summaries of textbooks and lectures. Now listen to a professor's response to the textbook passage.
So why did the humans in the Allen experiment actually increase the level of stress on the part of the subjects? Well, several ideas come to mind. For one thing, the human companions may actually have felt stress for the subjects and may have transmitted their higher stress levels to the subjects. A friend might want the subject to succeed at the task, and the subject might sense that. So their presence might increase the stress already present in the situation. In other words, the subject may have felt more pressure to do well instead of feeling support for completing the task. Or it's possible that the subjects were embarrassed because they feared that their performance might be evaluated by their friends, and failure, not completing the task correctly, that could cause them to risk losing some of the respect that had been built into their relationship. Clearly, a pet is non-judgmental about mathematical ability, whereas a human friend might register disappointment or criticism, or the subject might perceive criticism even when none existed. In a related follow-up study in which the subjects were asked to respond to the stress that they had felt during the task, several women mentioned the fact that, here, let me read this, that dogs don't get angry, dogs don't trade in their owners for new friends, and dogs don't stop loving their owners if they aren't successful. According to Allen, The data doesn't reveal exactly why the dogs provided greater support, but it's persuasive as to the value of pets in the lives of their owners when it's necessary to cope with stressful situations.
Exercise 99. Academic Topics. Summaries of textbooks and lectures. Now listen to a professor's response to the textbook passage.
Well, you've read about some of the perceived disadvantages of telecommuting. Now, let's look at some of the advantages that one company found when they surveyed employees who had elected to work from their computers at home for 2 hours at the beginning of every day. After trying a partial telecommuting schedule for 4 months, participating employees at International Box Corporation reported a marked decrease in job-related stress due to traditional commuting. By working at home from 8 in the morning until 10 o'clock mid-morning, employees noticed that they were able to avoid the overcrowded buses and trains at peak hours of use, and they didn't have to drive on the freeways at rush hour. A significant segment of the employees responding to the survey cited worrying about being late to work as a primary concern before the telecommuting option. According to those who expressed this concern, driving home during rush hour is less stressful than driving to work in the morning because there's an element of choice about when to leave and less pressure to arrive punctually. Some participants mentioned the cost of commuting by car as a reason to use a full-time telecommuting option, should the company decide to implement one. Another finding was that telecommuting, even part-time, seemed to influence the degree of job satisfaction on the part of participating employees. Why? Because they felt that they had more control over their time than they had experienced before the telecommuting schedule was instituted. And even though some of the employees actually worked longer than the required 2 hours from their home computers, they still reported a more positive attitude about their work. One reason that appeared frequently in the responses was that they enjoyed the quiet environment and the opportunity to dress casually during the early morning hours. Finally, the company discovered that the telecommuters were actually more productive as compared with a similar group of employees who worked on the regular 8 to 5 schedule at the office. Employees cited the advantage of an extended period of time to focus on projects that required concentration without the usual interruptions that usually occurred in the office, such as telephones ringing and colleagues appearing at the door. In fact, the most commonly mentioned activity for the telecommuting hours seemed to be report writing and special projects. Any questions?
Exercise 100. Academic Topics. Summaries of textbooks and lectures. Now listen to a professor's response to the textbook passage.
Let's consider the question about whether gifts can ever be considered voluntary and without compensation, like the definition that we find in an English language dictionary. Although we claim that in mainstream American culture, gift-giving is devalued when there are obligations attached to the gift, let's look more closely at that assumption. Are gifts really voluntary in modern American society? Or ultimately, do all gifts originate as social obligations with the potential for reciprocity? If we look at major social events in the United States, the kind to which invitations are sent, say a child's birthday party or a wedding, doesn't the invitation imply that a gift is required? And if so, is the act truly voluntary? For example, if your child receives an invitation to a birthday party at a classmate's home, and if you send a nice gift, well, isn't it likely that when the time comes for a birthday party for your child, you'll send an invitation to that classmate, and isn't it true that you'll expect a gift of more or less equal value? And what if the classmate isn't able to attend your child's party? won't you expect a gift to be delivered anyway? Why would you feel this way if gift-giving were voluntary, with no obligation attached? Instead of buying into public declarations and published definitions, we need to study our own culture as closely as we study what anthropologists have traditionally considered the more exotic cultures, by scrutinizing our history and literature, and by questioning the assumptions behind our own social actions, we position ourselves for a more honest appraisal of who we are and how our values intersect with the activities of our daily lives. In other words, we begin to understand our own culture. Ask yourself, why are you embarrassed by an expensive gift? Why do you feel uncomfortable accepting it? Is it because you know that along with the gift is the expectation that a gift should be reciprocated? Do you feel obligated to return an equally impressive gift? And what if your circumstances don't permit you to do so? In that case, is the gift a problem? If so, then it isn't only reciprocity that defines gift-giving in America, but also parity. I mean, keeping an accounting of the value of gifts so that equal exchanges are given at the appropriate times. Now consider this. Recognition can also be traded, as sociologist Warren Hagstrom has pointed out. Among my own subculture, academics, we pay careful attention to citations and acknowledgments of each other's works in an effort to extend and benefit from our gift-giving networks. I mean, the citation is our gift, and if it's a highly regarded colleague in the field, how different are these citations from the Kula gifts in New Guinea?
This is the end of the writing exercises. Remember, you have learned a lot. You are doing your best.